Welcome back to our continuing series as we engage in a conversation about spirituality, the experience of being human beings, responding to the spiritual core of who we are, continuing our conversation about the issues that come out of our spiritual journey and that are a result specifically of our change in perspective, our change in seeing. It shouldn't be a surprise to anyone that when you begin to see in a different way, when you open up your mind and your focus and you pay attention to the reality that surrounds you in a different way, that you're going to change. You're going to find an experience that is different than the experience that you might have had up until that moment. It's not unlike, contrast is not unlike waking up in the middle of the night and fumbling around in your room and bumping into furniture as you make your way to the bathroom because the light isn't on, and the same journey that you can take if you flip on the switch. All of a sudden you can see, and all of a sudden you can see everything much more clearly. And so as a result of that, your journey is going to be different, your perception is going to be different, your experience is going to be different. So when we're talking about spirituality, we're talking about waking up. We're talking about fully engaging our lives, trying to remain open to the mystery of God, the mystery of the universe, the mystery of human experience, which touches on the divine. So we're talking about all those things. Yesterday I introduced a new concept that flows from the experience of spirituality that I identified as contemplative spirituality, which I think is a spirituality that is rooted not only in the orthodoxy of the church and the strong tradition of spirituality in the church, but I think contemplative spirituality is probably a spirituality that would serve us well in the years ahead. It's always been important to have a contemplative perspective, but I think perhaps in the world in which we live today, with the challenges that we're faced with the experiences that seem to be common to us as a species, that the contemplative perspective has quite a bit to contribute. And one of the things that I mentioned yesterday was the experience of understanding the truths of reality that surround us, especially those that are emerging. I started talking about emergent theology. Emergent theology is our way of talking about the things that are sacred, the things that are divine, the things that we understand as holy, that come to our attention, that emerge from the experiences that are around us. They're not created at that moment. They've always been there. Perhaps they've been misunderstood, or perhaps they've been ignored, or perhaps they've been pushed down or oppressed. Or sometimes it might be as simple as we just simply weren't ready to pay attention to them. Our minds and our experiences were full of something else. So as a result, we didn't see it, we didn't make the connection. But at any rate, it emerges, and there all of a sudden is this new question. For a person that is coming at the world and understanding the world in which we live, not with a sense of certitude, but with that contemplative sense of mystery, the questions themselves are not challenging, they're welcoming. Because we understand that as we enter into the question, as we enter into the process of seeking an answer to the question, so much more of the mystery of God is revealed to us. We don't begin the journey of trying to answer the question in the same way, for instance, that a systematic theologian back in the 15th century would begin their journey, convinced that if they answer all the questions, they'll finally get to a point where there are no more questions and they have the certain absolute answer. Our contemplative spirituality, the way that we live in the world today, we understand and accept the fact that every question just leads us to another question, to another question, to another question. The universe in which we live is inexhaustible. It's an inexhaustible mystery. The fullness of God's life and love cannot be captured by a single word. It cannot be captured by a single idea, a single thought. And it might even be scary to say that it cannot be captured even by a single dogma or a single doctrine. What happens with dogmas, doctrines, words, sacred text, all those things, those are ways to help us enter into the mystery. They're ways also to help us see where we've come from, and they also point to us a direction where we can go. That's why, for instance, when we read the scriptures today, even scriptures that are 2,000 years old, it's not enough just to understand them within the context of their time and their experience. We also let that Word of God, and that's why we call it Revelation, the Word of God reveal to us the truth of the mystery of God for our time and for our place. And so we're grateful for the gifts that we have been given, the religious practices, traditions, disciplines that have been used by the church and by all the different religious traditions that exist in the world, because they each help us to grow and develop and become more human in the process of becoming more human, to become even more aware of our spiritual selves, our essential spiritual selves. So yesterday we talked about that emerging theology, the emerging truths, the emerging realities that call forth a new understanding, a new way of engaging them, a new way of connecting. And there were three that I talked about in particular. I talked about the question of what is authority? Where does authority come from? You know, it wasn't so long ago that we lived in a world in which we believed that all authority came directly from God, and God appointed certain people who were in charge, and as a result, all we had to do was pay attention to them. The divine right of kings, if you will, to use a shortcut, a way of expressing it in that way. Well, we understand that authority does, in fact, come from God, but we do not necessarily hold, as our ancestors did, that it is something that is given only to one or two people and everyone else has to obey. We understand authority in a completely different way because of our experience of democracy, our experience of consensus, our experience of discernment, all those new ideas that we constantly bump up against that were unheard of 500 years ago. So 500 years ago, if someone would say to someone who was their superior, well, I'm not quite sure that this is how the discernment of God is at work in this particular question, your superior would look at you askance and basically say, I honestly don't care what you think is going on. This is what you're supposed to do. Well, today that we would look at that and we'd say, wait a second, there's something that's not right here. So that's authority. We talked a little bit about that. We talked about the fact that what does it mean to be a human being? What does it mean to have self-reflective consciousness? What kind of responsibility do we have as human beings that are aware of a past, a present, and a future? The fact that we have consciousness and have the ability to reflect on what has occurred and to anticipate what is to come is a unique gift that has been given to us by our Creator God. It's something that separates us, we believe, from all the other life forms, at least that we're aware of. So what does it mean to be responsible and to be self-reflective? What does it mean to be a human being? What does it mean to be a human being in this particular time and place, as opposed to another particular time or place? Is my humanness more important because I live in a wealthy country? Am I more valuable because of who I am, because I bear the title of a certain citizenship? Does that mean more than, for instance, a person that comes from a country that's struggling, or that people don't enjoy the same amount of freedom and wealth that we enjoy? So all those questions come into play when we ask, what does it mean to be a human being? And then finally, of course, it's going to be a question that we constantly struggle with as we grow together as a community of people, and that is, how can we live together? I think one of the blessings, if you will, of the current pandemic is it is helping us ask the question in a completely different way than we've ever asked before. What does it mean for us when we say that we're a community? What does it mean for us when we say we're a city? What does it mean for us when we say we're a state? What does it mean for us when we say we are a country? What are our responsibilities? What are the ways that we're called upon to act and support one another? So how can we live together? So all those questions, you could refer to them and say, well, those are not spiritual questions. Those are political questions, or those are cultural questions. Well, they're not, because we understand that we're spiritual beings having human experiences. So we understand that the way that we're going to encounter the sacred is through our human experience. It's the way that we're going to understand who we are. It's the way that we're going to accept the invitation of God to be grace-filled. And it has a profound effect on what we believe, and it has a profound effect on our spiritual journey. So let's take those three issues. What is authority? What does it mean to be a human being? How can we live together? And let's ask some specific spiritual questions about those, so that you can see the connection between human experience and spirituality, and you can see that it's not just a political discussion, it's not just a social discussion, it's not just a cultural discussion. If human beings are having a discussion, it's always going to be rooted in spirituality and who we are and how we've been created. So here's a singular question that is a spiritual question. How much authority does a human person have individually? So, as a single human person, how much authority do I have individually? Do I have the right to make a decision that affects other people without any consequence whatsoever? Do I have the right to make up my own rules and regulations and expect everyone else to pay attention to them? Do I have the right to determine what is acceptable and what is not acceptable, and to live that way? Do I have the right to refuse to be guided, to be led, to be directed? So how much authority do I have as a human being? How important is it as a human being to enter into dialogue with another person? How important is it to arrive at consensus? Is it necessary to act and to ask for permission for something? Are there moments in my life when obedience is required? Or is it enough for me to simply to be true to myself, accept the consequences of what my decisions make, and call it a day? So you see, those are ramifications not only that have an effect on ourselves as human beings, they have an effect on how we live, how we believe, how we act, and why. In a question in which we live today, and we start talking about human authority, one of the big questions that we don't seldom think about, but nonetheless is played in the background, and which some people are thinking about quite profoundly, not so much in the United States, but in Europe, certainly, is a question that might startle you. Because in the United States, we describe ourselves as a Christian nation. But in Europe and in many parts of the world, the question is not, are you a Christian nation? The question is, what does it mean when you say that you're a post-Christian society? In other words, Christianity and the viewpoints and the opinions and the dogmas and the doctrines of Christianity no longer dominate that society. And the society has become post-Christian in some ways, and in other societies has never been Christian. So what does it mean to live in a post-Christian society or in a society that is not Christian? And if it is a society that's post-Christian or is not Christian, what replaces the Christian morality? What replaces the Christian ethic? How do we understand what we do, how we live, what we choose, what is important to us? Another question, and this is one that we see played out again and again and again, and the very mention of it makes some people very, very anxious. But nonetheless, it's an important question. It's a very important human question, and it's a very important spiritual question. And it has to do with our sexuality. What does human sexuality mean? 150, 200 years ago, there might be a very clear answer. But today, that answer seems not to be as clear. For instance, what role does gender play in human relationships? So what role does gender play? Does gender have any role to play in our understanding of sexuality? What role does gender play? How about human sexuality itself? Is it just procreational? There's a whole Christian ethic that suggests that human sexuality is just procreational. It exists purely for the reasons of procreating the human race. Anything else, any other use of sexuality is unacceptable. But we also know that sexuality is relational. It's the way that two people, a group of people, react and live with each other and relate to each other. So we know that it's relational. We also know there is an aspect of sexuality that seems to be recreational. What does that mean? How are we to understand that? What are we to do? So there's all sorts of questions that deal with sexuality, and those are questions that we see playing out every single day. And I think the human sexual questions help us understand also that whole theory or that whole idea of emerging truth. It's not that a form of sexuality just was made up or created on the spot and is now emerging. It's always been there. But it's never been given permission to manifest itself, or the time was not right to discuss it, or people who had that particular experience of sexuality or that particular need to express their gender identity were discouraged from doing so. So how does our society, our church, our community, our family, ourselves as individual people, how do we relate to human sexual identity and the manifestation of our human sexuality in the world in which we live? And if that question gets you really stirred up and going, there are some really wonderful theological questions, some of which are reminiscent of questions that would be asked 500 years ago. One of the questions, which I thought was a kind of silly question that systematic theologians could have argued about 500 years ago, was a question as silly as this: how many angels can dance on the head of a pin? So how many angels can dance on the head of a pin? It sounds like a silly question, doesn't it? Why would anyone spend any time trying to answer that question or spend any amount of energy even thinking about it? But there was a time and there was a place in which that was an important question, because it finished the system. It answered the question. It put closure to the idea. So finding an answer was very important. Some might think a silly question for somebody living today is, what happens if we find life, self-conscious life, somewhere else in the universe? What happens if we encounter self-reflective human species like people? Are they in need of redemption? Does the message of Jesus apply to the entire universe, or does it just apply to our experience? Now, obviously, that is a question that is not discussed around the kitchen table in the morning. It's way, way out there. But nonetheless, those are the types of questions that people think about because there are ramifications to them. And again, from a contemplative spirit, a contemplative experience, the questions are not threatening, the questions are not silly, they just open up another experience of who we are as human beings. There is one theological question that dominates progressive Christianity, and it has some influence within more normal, traditional, and Orthodox Christian denominations, including our own denomination, Roman Catholic, that has specific ramifications and are serious in our discussion. And that is what is understood as the theology of atonement. Now, we might not think about the theology of atonement very much, but basically the theology of atonement says that human beings sinned and that in response to their sin, atonement was necessary. And the atonement that was necessary was the death of Jesus. And so Jesus died for our sins. So we're all very familiar with the theology of atonement. But in some progressive Christian denominations, the question is, how can a God who is so omnipotent, how can that God be so powerless as to have to demand that his Son die in order to redeem us? I told you that was a big question. It has a lot of ramifications on who we are as human beings, how we live, and how we understand ourselves in the world in which we live. And so those are all questions that come to us, again, from a spiritual perspective, that come to us from this idea of emerging church, that come to us this idea of a different lived reality. And they all speak to us about this whole issue of how we see the world, how we experience the world, how we understand the world. Again, I would go back and say that a spiritual journey that is rooted in the traditional Orthodox understanding of contemplation is uniquely qualified to prepare us for the questions that we might face. Now, obviously, none of us probably individually are going to ask huge questions and are not going to have to provide a large reflection or a response to a question that will guide the human journey for years to come. For most of us, that's not our role. But all of us are going to be asked to deal with essential questions that are lived out in our own experience, in our own families, and in our own communities. It would seem that that is such a huge task and is such a difficult task that how would you respond to it? Well, thankfully there is a response. And there is a response that came to us, as I mentioned yesterday when I started talking about St. John the 23rd and the Second Vatican Council. Pope St. John the 23rd in 1961, in his encyclical Mater et Magistra, gave us a blueprint, a contemplative way of understanding and living in the multifaceted and many questioned and mysterious universe in which we live. And these are the directions that he gave us. He said, the first thing that you should do when you try to figure out what it is that God is asking of us and how it is that we are to respond to the reality around us, the first thing you do is review the concrete situation. See what's actually there. Secondly, try to form a judgment. Try to make a judgment about what you see. And don't hold fast to the judgment. Make a judgment only as a marker, as a way of measuring how you decide. So it's something that you can measure against. So the first thing you do is you see the issue, the problem, the challenge, the invitation. You make a judgment about how you're going to respond. And then, and only then, you act. And you act always in a way that tests the judgment that you make to see if it's valid or not. And if it's not valid, then you set it aside and you try to make another judgment. You try to grow and you try to develop. But you don't let your concrete situation paralyze you. So you don't retreat into the past. You don't dig in your heels and refuse to move. You don't bury your head in the sand. What you do is you see it. Well, seeing, as we know, is extremely important to our contemplative spirit. It's extremely important to the way that we understand the world in which we live. So since we know that we're spiritual beings, what we try to do is see the world from the perspective of the spiritual being, and we know as spiritual beings that the way that we're going to experience God is through human activity. So our humanity. So you see what it is and try to understand what it is. And then, once you see it, you make a judgment about it. Again, the judgment is simply a marker. It says, based on what I see, and I acknowledge the fact that I can't see everything, but based on what I see, this is the response that I think I need to make. And then, of course, you act on what you see and how you judge it, always open to the possibility that it could change, that it might be different. This way of living, of seeing, of judging, and acting that St. John the 23rd talked about in that encyclical, Mater et Magistra, was a way for the church to react in the world in which it lived. It gave rise to the Second Vatican Council, and it gave rise to the constitution of the church in the modern world, that is central to our understanding of Second Vatican Council. It basically said, in this world in which we live, with all the questions that we have, all the challenges that we have, all the opportunities that we have, the church will not dig in its heels. It's not going to retreat to the past. It's not going to be arrogant. It's going to be humble. It's going to move forward, always seeing, always judging, always acting in the way of Jesus, and always believing that the Spirit of God is alive and well and present in our midst. And in the process of doing that, to be open to the mystery of the fullness of God's life and love. So the challenges that we experience today, all those things that are part of our human existence, are all ways that we can encounter and we can connect with a better part of ourselves, if you will, the spiritual part of ourselves, the graced part of ourselves. It's a way to encounter God, and it's a way to be nourished by the Spirit of God. So I hope that that was not too much for you this morning. I hope that it gave you a lot to think about, that I didn't confuse you, and that it was time for you, as it has been for me, time well spent. So tomorrow we'll continue our journey and we'll continue our conversation, and I look forward to being with you. Have a great day.